Okay, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to See It, a show about movies and stuff. This week, we're talking about the state of cinema. We've had a very important film critic, A.O. Scott, put in his 2 weeks' notice, if you will. He's no longer going to be ascribing to film criticism, and I brought in a film critic friend of my own to kind of talk about what's the fallout of this, what does this mean for movies in general. So we're going to talk about the state of movies. It's going to be hopefully a fun conversation, but also an enlightening conversation for my followers. Just real quick, we're going to do some quick introductions. I'm Brian Williams. As you know, Brian Knows Movies. You can find me at Brian Knows Movies everywhere. Thank you so much for continuing to support the live stream show, for supporting all my videos and my reviews. Follow me on Insta, follow me on Facebook. I'm going to start tweeting again here pretty soon and start blogging again pretty soon as well. So website's brianknowsmovies.com. And I just want to say thank you for your continued support. I have a very good friend I've known for over a decade now, I think, who does film criticism as well as he's a cultural critic. He's a jack of all trades and a master of all trades too. He does TV, he does streaming. If there's any type of con or anything going on, he's giving you the great newest news on that. It's Desmond with Two Black Nerds. I'm going to let him go ahead and introduce himself so I don't continue to butcher it. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Desmond.
Man, first and foremost, I'm happy to be here. I don't think you realize how much I think you meant to my journey and doing all of these things. You actually took me to my first con in Planet Comic Con. I don't know if you remember that. It was my very first one. So thank you so much for being, I think, such a light and beacon in my own life, man. My name is Desmond Weathers. I am, as Brian said, one half and a co-host of Two Black Nerds podcast, where we cover everything from rooted in film, of course, but from TV shows, video games, wrestling, and fandom and pop culture, really anything and everything under the sun, man. And so, again, happy to be here, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So I had to bring in some backup. I received a podcast from one of my followers, Marcus Johnson. Shout out to him. He sent me a podcast from the New York Times, the New York Times Daily, and they were doing an expose on A.O. Scott, or also known as Tony Scott. He is, for those who are unfamiliar, a huge critic in the scene of film criticism. You've probably heard of Roger Ebert and Roper and Pauline Kael and all those kind of big names. Well, he's kind of been that for our generation. He started in 2000 with the New York Times and has been a pretty big name in film criticism. His words are taken to heart. I've been following him for quite some time. Unfortunately, his most famous thing that he's done or been involved in was a back and forth with Sam Jackson way back when I was in college. He didn't really care for the Avengers too much and let it be known. And Sam Jackson doesn't hold his tongue and let him know what he thought of him. So we'll probably talk about that a little bit here today too. But he also guest hosted Ebert and Roper at the movies when Roger Ebert was out sick. So he's been on the scene for quite some time, and he has decided to stop reviewing films. He said he's still a film lover. He's going to continue to go to films, obviously, but he's moving over to literary criticism. He's going to be doing book criticism for the New York Times. But after a 20-year career of leading film criticism for a New York Times, arguably the most established news, I don't even want to say paper, it's not even a newspaper, it's news multimedia conglomerate in the country, he is exiting that position, and he tells a little bit why on this Daily Show. I got a chance to listen to it, and there were some things that he said that really resonated with me and some things that I wanted to have some discussions about. Before we get into some details, Desmond, what was your overall feeling after listening to what A.O. Scott had to say?
You know, a little bittersweet, I think, or I wouldn't even say bittersweet because I don't know how much that implies. I think a little bit more emotional stake, I would say, though, but I think mixed bag of feelings towards the way I think he was approaching his decision to step down and go do something else apart from film criticism. There's a lot of things in the interview that do feel organic, and I understand where he's coming from, but there's also a lot of other things that feel like he's taking the easy way out in a lot of ways, and he's afraid to butt heads. You know, as a critic, even Michael Barbaro in the podcast interview as well was kind of trying to challenge him on some things as well, where the state of film is evolving, And I think Mark Barbaro, even in the same way, was trying to challenge him. But what if things are just evolving? Can you evolve with it, or things like that? And I think
Mm-hmm.
there's questions of things that we can talk about as well. But yeah, just overall, just a mixed bag of feelings towards the way I think he's choosing to handle this.
Absolutely, and I also think that yeah, let's just go ahead and get into it because it was some very strange things that he said that I don't know where he got some of his views from, other than being jaded just from doing this business so long. So for my followers, once again, that don't know who A.O. Scott is, he's huge in film criticism world, but he's also very old school. I feel like the space for film criticism has expanded so much past the pen, and he's a traditional. I go see the movie, I write up the review, and I move on to the next one. He's not involved in podcasts or multimedia outlets. He's not doing anything on social media. He doesn't really engage with even actors, directors, writers, creators. He's a very old school. Again, I think of Pauline Kael. He's nowhere near as mean as Pauline. Pauline Kael, if you know, is a big film critic from the 70s and 80s, and she was pretty ruthless.
Mm-hmm.
He's not like that, but he's in that same type of school. So as things continue to change because of streaming and just the way franchises are happening, he just seems to be left out in the dust. And I actually want to start with streaming. One of the things that he talked about, one of the reasons he said he's leaving the film criticism space is because he feels like that everything's the same. Everything has basically been regulated to franchises and superhero films. And those spaces are not as creatively full as, say, an original piece that's coming out. And I think I disagree pretty harshly on that, but he talks about there's no singular objects to review anymore. Everything leads to the next thing because it's either a sequel or a prequel or a legacy sequel or the franchise. Everything has to connect, and you have to think about all these things not only just as a singular entity, but also how it fits into these overall universes. And it's something that's very different from what he's used to reviewing. And the question is franchises and sequels and prequels, this generation of movie making that we're in, has it done the film space good, or is it bad, or is it just is?
It's so weird, I think, the way in which we have to talk about this, because it is very true that a lot of franchises and all these universes are ruling at least a decent part of the box office right now. Not necessarily, I wouldn't say cinema, because it's very clearly other films and projects and smaller films and indie films that continue to get, I think, a decent amount of exposure. I mean, you can even look at the something as big as the Academy Awards and question how many franchises and universes are a part of that award show. There is part of it where I can see where there is there is a pretty high saturation, I would say, of universes in Marvel and DC that is a part of the conversation right now. I don't think anybody would argue against that. I think blaming everything solely on, fandoms, to me, it's a hard sell. It really
Mm-hmm.
is a hard sell, because there's so many factors and things that come into the conversation. You can't just say, well, the fans of all Marvel films are ruining film by itself. That is why
Mm-hmm.
I just can't be a critic anymore because of that. To me, I could even argue, as somebody who's embedded within this, right? As somebody who watches these films quite frequently, I could argue that there's a ton of criticism coming out, actually, about a lot of these films. And it's not just you.
Mm-hmm.
People notoriously did not love Eternals. It is like a whole thing that people notoriously didn't love Eternals. It's not easy for them anymore. We're not going to pretend like Ant-Man Quantumania just did amazing.
Mm-hmm.
We can't pretend like the DCEU has been this amazing thing that has a holy grail of films that hasn't been touched. These are things that have been heavily criticized, and part of the reason why things have been gutted and people are trying new things now to this day. So I think for him to say that it can't be touched, or it's without form, and it's
Mm-hmm.
uncriticizable or whatever, it definitely feels like, I don't know, he's seeing things wrong, at least differently from somebody who's embedded, I guess, in that community as I am.
Yeah, and it's so strange to me that he's because one of his things is going back to the Sam Jackson thing for people who don't know the story. Basically, he didn't like the Avengers. The Avengers was I can't remember maybe the fifth movie in all of Phase One or the sixth movie, and we've had a few superhero films that was connected to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. At that point, we had a bunch of different Spider-Man films and failures in other spaces to create and successes to create superhero films. And so maybe everything was running together for him. Sam Jackson basically said he needs to get a new job. And he said this back in 2006, 2007, whenever the Avengers movie comes out, because he had said basically that and I'm paraphrasing here, that the film was vapid and it was completely underdone. It had some good dialogue, but for the most part, it was without form. And it was like, what movie were you watching, first of all? And second, it seemed like he was creating unfair criticisms at that point, but also alluding to the fact that superhero films had never been criticized ever. Superhero film, all those bad X-Men films, a lot of the Spider-Man films, a lot of the Daredevil has been considered one of the worst movies of the decade. Catwoman was out around by then as well. Halle Berry's Catwoman. There were so many films that were superhero films that had been lambasted not only by critics but by fans as well. Other thing that really irked me about what he said very early was that superhero films were crowding out the spaces for where you would normally see like literary adaptations and original filmmaking and those types of things. And I've collected comics for almost all my life. I remember I was collecting comics in high school. People thought it was quirky, but I didn't get picked on. That whole myth of watching anime and reading comics and all that stuff is not true. People thought it was actually kind of interesting more than anything, but I've been doing it forever. Comic book writing and comic book storytelling is one of the few unique creative spaces that American society has produced for the world. It's one of the few original things that we've produced in terms of literary works. Comic books is a unique and original contribution to literature. And comic books also, so when you see these comic book movies, they are being adapted from literature. Comic books are, now you may not respect that literature. You may think that it's childish, and comic books originally were made for children. If you look at the evolution of comic books, they started writing for teenagers because their audiences were growing, and then for young adults, and then full adults. So you have comic books that are made for everybody of all ages and all walks of life at this point. But you can't tell me like works from Neil Gaiman and others doesn't have a very important literary impact on society, because it does. And so how dismissive he was about comic books and comic book characters really irked me, because I feel like that's something that we've seen for a lot of old school film critics, is this dismissal of comic book movies as a lesser art form. When you look, especially in the golden age of movie making, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, all the way really into the 70s, when we were adapting movies from books that were super racist and super sexist, and these super racist and super sexist books that we're adapting, Gone with the Wind on Up, we're winning every award imaginable, right? And I feel like we have to come to a space to where that bias needs to be nipped in the bud. Am I overreacting on that? I just had a mouthful. I'm sorry, but am I overreacting with that?
No, I don't think you're overreacting at all, because I think if you're gonna, criticize something, at least be historically accurate in what you're trying to say, right? If you're saying comic book movies aren't taking away space from other those literary works that are being adapted, you should then, to me, address, again, based off of what you just said too, you should address maybe you just don't like the comic book landscape as an art form that is then transitioned into movies. If that's your argument, make that argument, not that comic book movies are taken away from those other literary pieces of work that have been adapted into movies at some point in time. I don't think that's an overreaction at all. In fact, again, I think that's lack of understanding of what exactly I think you're talking about, and the history of what you're talking about, right? Comic book movies and comics itself have a history. It is what it is. Again, if you don't agree with that history, or agree at least the practice of that, I think that that should be a little bit more known than I think the argument he's trying to make of comic book movies are taking away all these other spaces for all these other things and so on and so forth. So no, I don't think you're overreacting at all.
As if Jack Nicholson didn't win an Academy Award for Batman for playing the Joker back in, was that 1990s Academy Awards? I mean,
Yep.
they've been around
Yep.
for as long as a lot of my viewers have been alive. So I don't get that. So yeah, so I think that there's an issue with the space, and why I wanted to get into the space. I'm sure that had something to do with why you and Jordan are in the space as well, to give a counterbalance to some of these old school ways of thinking
Yeah.
about movies. But I will say that there is some interesting things going on when you look at the box office. So he starts in 2000. And if you look at the top 20 domestic gross, How to Get Stole Christmas, Castaway, Mission Impossible 2, that's the first franchise, Gladiator, What Women Want, Perfect Storm, Meet the Parents became a franchise, X-Men became a franchise, Scary Movie became a franchise, Dinosaur, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, Aaron Brockovich, Charlie's Angels became a franchise,
Mm-hmm.
Traffic, Nutty Professor was a franchise, Big Mama's House became a franchise, Remember the Titans, The Patriot, and Chicken Run. So you have 7 of the top 20 were franchises or franchises of some sort that were in the top 20 of box offices. Fast forward to last year, every film that was in the top 20 except for Elvis, Uncharted, Nope, Smile, The Lost City, Bullet Train, The Bad Guys. So it pretty much flipped. There were 7 films in 2022 that were in the top 20 that were not a
Mm-hmm.
part of a sequel or franchise. So basically, the landscape for box office, what people are going to the movies to see, is flipped. Now, I will say, to me, this is a bit troubling. One of my goals, especially after the pandemic, is to get people back into the movies. And as
Right.
I look at my top 20 for 2022, there are some. I was so surprised that Everything Everywhere All at Once didn't make the top 20 for a domestic box here in the States.
Yeah.
But there were so many films that I feel like people missed that were really worth seeing in the theater.
Mm-hmm.
But if people are spending $20 just to get into the theater, they want to see some stuff explode. Right? They want to
Exactly.
see
Mm-hmm.
some things flying at their face. It's harder and harder to convince people. Even friends of mine, I'll talk about movies glowingly, and for 10 minutes, I'm like, oh, that's great. I'll wait for it to come on Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
Because people
Exactly.
don't want to come to the theaters like that because it's too expensive. So I guess, how do we, as critics and cultural critics, film critics, what have you, how do we get people back into the theaters? Or do you even think that's important at this point?
I always think it's important. It's a medium I love and cherish, and I think most of the time, probably about 90% of the time, a movie always feels better in theaters than it does at home. In fact, they do talk about this on the podcast a little bit, right, with the streaming stuff, that they
Mm-hmm.
believe because there's so many decent kind of films, I think, on streaming, or they were actually arguing that TV at one point in time was some at some point in time taken away from movie theaters because TV was just so good. They're saying, why do I have to go to the movies when I can watch Breaking Bad at home, when I can watch Mad
Mm-hmm.
Men at home, when I can watch all these good movies at home? And there is some merit to that. And I think there is some merit to the way streaming works as well. That is partially flipping the box office. Not only that, but I think COVID, you know what I mean, helps flip that too. It's like if people are out of the habit of going to the movies, of course it takes a movie like Top Gun, a crazy not only sequel with X amount of years later, but a big film in name in Tom Cruise to bring people back to a movie theater to see something that's as big as that. So I definitely think there's something there, but we need to get people back. And why or how, I guess, we get people back, that's a hard one. It really is a hard one, especially again in the age of streaming. If I said, when you tell people Everything Everywhere All at Once is in, you should go see that in theaters, and they watch the trailer, they don't see, I don't know, the Batman, you know what I mean? They don't see that same
Mm-hmm.
excitement until they watch the film to go and watch it. And I think that's a really hard thing to sell. It really is, unless you are like us, right? We love the movies, we'll go. We don't even have to have these shows. We were going to the movies anyway. You know what I mean? We don't have
Mm-hmm.
to have streaming. We were going to the movies anyway. And it's hard to get, I think, the casual viewer to buy into the smaller non-blockbuster franchisey films. It really is, and I really don't have the answer to it. But I will say, a lot of it is up to some of these studios and companies for marketing, right? If they're spending, shoot, I'll just do a ballpark range, but $50 million just to market Fast X,
Hmm.
how much money do you really have to market the next Universal movie that comes out that's probably a smaller budget, that could be even an Academy Award contender, that is a really good film? How do you sell that? I really don't know the answer to it, but it's definitely something I think that should be put on, partially on viewers for sure, to I think be more intentional of what they watch and to go to the theaters, but definitely, most definitely, for sure, on these movie studios and in people who have control over marketing. I think that's a big part of it as well.
There's a film coming out this weekend called 1001. I haven't seen it, but it won
Hmm.
the major award at Sundance. It was a film that was directed by a black woman, uh, mostly minority cast. Tiana Taylor plays the lead in this film. It's about
Yep.
a mother who is trying to reunite with her son and successfully does that, and has to like change his name and all these different things to keep her son, because the state's coming to take him, because her life's kind of in shambles too, and she's trying to pick up the pieces. And it looks so interesting, and it's so great to see that specifically black women film directors are behind the camera being able to make these movies now. And I'm afraid that nobody's going to go see it because the
Hmm.
promotions behind it haven't been that strong. And also, I just don't think anybody's heard of it coming out, and it's coming out with Dungeons and Dragons.
Right.
It's the big movie that year, and you also have John
Hmm.
Wick right there that's still there. And you still have Shazam
Hmm.
too, Fury of the Gods. I know that didn't really make that much money yet, but it's still there. You have all these major franchises, right, that are going to compete and probably going to win viewers. So I'm trying to figure out how to get people in to see films like that. Now, one of the things I will say that he talks about how the crowding out effect has happened, where basically major studios don't want to take chances. I think that it's even more, I don't know, sinister is the word I want to use with that, because it has some very negative
Hmm.
content. But maybe it is where I'm using. Maybe I'll say just nuance for now. The way that a lot of these independent films are being created, when you say independent films, just for my viewers to know what that is, that means that the creators, the writers, directors, the team has to independently fundraise to get the film made. So they're going to people who want to invest in the arts, famous people, organizations, very small production companies, to get the money to make the film, with the goal of selling that film to one of the major outlets for distribution, whether it's Universal, Paramount, all those people that you heard of. The people get the film made, and then they sell the rights to it. A lot of times at these film festivals,
Hmm.
Telluride, so on and so forth. The system used to not work like that. It used to be, he's right, it used to be the big boxes would take on these smaller projects from beginning to end, right? And
Right. Hmm.
so they would hire the director. They would get whatever book adaptation they want to do or whatever script they want to do. They punch up the script, and they would be a part of that process from beginning to end, whether it's the major studio itself or one of its subsidiaries, like a Orion or a Neon or
Hmm.
I hate to say it, but the Weinstein Company. They
Yeah.
used to do a lot of that type of stuff.
Hmm.
So on one hand, your big major studios aren't making these films; they're just buying these films for distribution, and then they're not even really putting that much money behind them. A lot of times, they're just buying them for clout. I feel like,
Hmm.
but also what we've seen is that minorities and women and minority women have been very successful in these spaces, especially the last 5 or 6 years, in independently fundraising and producing their films and getting it out to distribution. Right? So
Right.
there's no longer the same type of gatekeeping that there used to be with when it was just the studios doing it. When you had to have a
Hmm.
Steven Spielberg make The Color Purple. Even though I know The Color Purple made $1 billion,
Right.
but The Color Purple would have went straight to streaming and would have been bought by Netflix nowadays, right? Because of the type of
Yep.
film it is.
For
So
sure.
I'm a little torn on what to think about that issue in Hollywood, in terms of they don't feel like they have to completely commit to the art form. They can just bite on the back, and after everybody says that it's good, they'll buy it, as opposed to taking risk on filmmakers in the
Yeah, it's
beginning of the
it's one of the reasons
process.
why I love A24. A24 is like, no, we like A24 always believes, to me, I think, in the process and the people who's trying to tell a story, and I wish there were more people out there like A24. I wish the big studios were looking at A24 and was like, dang, we should probably do a little bit more of the distribution work that they're doing as well, because it's hard. A24 can't do it all. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? And it feels like they do have a hefty load. We're trying to put out movies like that. Even a movie like 1001, man, I just wish, again, like a large studio would at least decided to distribute it, because then they would have the marketing, it would have everything behind it that it needs. But I understand, I feel the exact same way you feel. It's like, on one hand, the the studios are, not involved, and now it seems like their minority women are kind of conquering the space in ways in which they should. The fact that 1001 is directed by a black woman is 10 out of 10, because you've talked about it, we've talked about it. There's not enough or even you could really count the amount of movies directed by black women on your hands and toes, and that's not okay. And now it's like, now that they're happening more, it's almost like stepping stones in a way. It's like, in my mind, it's like, now what's the next step, right? It's like, now that they're owning that space, how can we get them to that next level without these major studios? How can we? I really don't. Again, I don't know the answer to that, but it's something that needs to be done, and I'm just as torn on it as you are. Part of me doesn't want to have to need larger studios, especially if they're in a space where they can get it made and made
Mm-hmm.
well, and it's a good movie. Part of me doesn't want in the studio at all. Part of me just wishes people would be like, well, let's go support these independent films. But unfortunately, it just doesn't work like that. It really doesn't. So I think it's something else that should be studied.
I did a video in February about my top 20 or top 10 black directors. It was either top 10 or top 20. It was a lot of directors I went through. And I talked about how I struggled to find more than 4 black women directors.
Yep.
And I got ate up in the comments for that. And my point was, Hollywood just never doesn't believe in women in general in terms of sitting behind
Mm-hmm.
the camera. Historically, that's starting to change, but especially black women. And it was two sides of it. There was one that I was saying I was a misogynist and racist on my
Mm-hmm.
comments, which I thought was interesting because I was like, I'm pointing out a problem here. But the other one was like these racist trolls talking about, maybe they just didn't want the job. You ever think about that? I'm like, you're telling me that black women didn't want to direct this and act in these roles and all these other things. I'm like, are you crazy?
Right.
Is that really the logic that you have? But I really want black women to win because everybody else been winning for quite some time now.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Right.
but the thing is, also with the way this independent filmmaking project works, if you can't get your stuff accepted by a one of these festivals, it's really hard to get into in front of people to buy distribution rights. So
Mm-hmm.
now the festivals have become more and more important. I'm hoping that they don't become gatekeepers, just like the studios were gatekeepers for
Mm-hmm.
years and years and years. We'll see how that goes. Going back to the streaming though, he was very much. I think that was probably the best points that he was making was about streaming and how streaming has kind of watered down the way that we intake
Yeah,
film.
I agree
There's
with that
so
too.
many films out there that are being created not only for streamers but are being bought by streamers that there's no way anybody's going to watch it all, and you shouldn't have to watch it all, but it's also very hard to navigate what's great and what's not. I think that The Irishman is probably a top 6 or 7 Martin Scorsese film for me,
Yeah.
and even though it's super long, and
Yeah.
there's so many people who still haven't even heard of it. I'm surprised. Like when you leave like the film world and people who are really into film and you start talking about some of these movies, they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. They would know what Goodfellas is because Goodfellas was in theaters for a
That's
year
true.
and then was on cable and everybody had cable and you watched HBO. You had HBO or HBO West, whatever it was, to choose
Mm-hmm.
from, you're going to see Goodfellas, right? That doesn't exist anymore. Variety is the spice of life now. So I don't know if that's a good thing. I don't think it's a good thing the way the things are watered down. But I will say this. There is a bubble with streaming. There is not one streamer that exists. Netflix is the oldest one. HBO Max, Apple TV, Hulu, Paramount Plus, Peacock, you name the streamer, Crunchyroll, you name the streamer. I don't know about Crunchyroll. Maybe Crunchyroll does, but every other streamer has not had a profit. They have not turned a profit
Mm,
in their
yeah.
existence. And you're starting to hear executives like Bob Iger at Disney Plus and other executives talk about this, like how much longer are we going to continue to pump money into the streaming services and we're not seeing a profit. So I am concerned slash interested in your thoughts on that, and what do you see happening to streamers moving in the future?
Man, I think this has been a ongoing conversation for a long time. Of course, most notably Netflix, because they just throw money at content. That is
Mm-hmm.
the thing they do. They just throw money at content all the time. We're in such a weird position too, where I feel like even if there was a streaming service who threw less money at quantity and more on quality, they would be afraid to do that because of competition with everybody else. It's almost like part of me almost feels like everybody has to want to do it together in some form or fashion in order. But what I don't understand is why isn't turning a profit, that to me that should be motivation enough, is wanting to turn a profit more than anything else, than for people just to talk about this thing that happened. Like it's crazy the amounts of money again Netflix will throw at content just for us to talk about the same 3 or 4 projects every year. It's really
Same
insane.
ones.
Everybody knows.
Stranger Things and
Yup.
Handmaid's Tale for Hulu or whatever it is.
Yeah,
It's always the same
handmade
stuff.
stuff for Hulu. Used to be the Orange is the New Black, and used to be House of Cards. And a year is long, and for them to come out only talking about those amount of shows is kind of crazy when you think about it. Part of me wants, I think, some kind of competition to where they're not throwing every piece of content at into these streaming services. Again, I don't know what that looks like, because to me it feels like that's how they feel like they should make money. Their model, I feel like, is stuck in one way right now, and I feel like they're afraid to change it
Mm-hmm.
because they feel like
Mm-hmm.
they're going to be again behind everybody. Let's say Paramount Plus was like, ooh, let's just start putting out all the good stuff we have, not everything in the world. Let's put our top, let's say 50 projects that we have on our streaming service. Then everybody starts to, oh, there's nothing on Paramount Plus, and I can
Mm.
see from a business standpoint why they would feel that way. Why they would be like, man, I guess we just got to put all this fluff or whatever on the streaming service. So I think I'm worried that they're stuck in that position without somebody taking the first step in trying to change the streaming game. To me, again, it should be Netflix. They
Mm-hmm.
have all these things. They pick up all these projects. They pick up all these movies, and again, according to reports or the numbers that we at least hear, they probably the ones that are in the most debt, or at least behind in terms of turning a profit. Let's say Netflix decided to put out 20 movies in one year. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to put out 20
Even
movies.
their 1,000 Christmas movies.
There are 1,000 Christmas, just 20. They say they're going to put out 3 Christmas movies, 3 Halloween, and X however many else movies a year. I feel like they would get value in that, right? I feel like it would look differently if among those 20 it was The Irishman, it was A Marriage Story, it was a lot of the good movies that they decided to put time and energy into to make a
Mm-hmm.
good film. Not only that, but I actually seen Irishman in a theater here in New York. Actually, it was great. It was long, don't get me wrong, but it was the fact that I had that experience, I think, was different. So I can imagine a streamer like that doing, not only again focusing on not putting out all this quantity of things, but putting out
Mm-hmm.
quality. That makes more sense to me, that people would want to go see, no, knowing that Netflix's value is now up, right? That people know Netflix movies are good because they actually
Mm-hmm.
spend time to make them good. Now Netflix puts out a movie and Netflix goes, okay, but you have to go see this in theaters first.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's different. Now people are like, oh man, I have to wait for this, or I have to, now I might get some butts and some seats, and quantity is doesn't look as appealing as quality might. So I don't know. I think there's some ideas there that people can mess with, but I think everybody is afraid to take the plunge in order to make their company profitable.
I don't understand why they don't do that actually more. Like I saw The Gray Man in theaters, and I actually like The Gray Man a lot more than most people. But I think it's because I saw it in theaters. I like the way that it looked on the screen, right? And my
Yeah.
theater was fairly full. It was out for like a week. Like I don't know why like these direct to streaming services don't use because I think the theaters definitely want the movies in their on their
Mm-hmm.
screens. So do a limited release or not limited in terms of the number of rooms, but limited in terms of time. A 2 week,
Right.
3 week release. Early release and get some money on the front end and then put it on your streamer and then get other folks to watch there. I don't know why they don't do that. I have a feeling that there's going to be some extreme consolidation, especially some of these smaller streaming services where they'll start to sell off the rights to what they have. And we'll see stuff like Netflix and Hulu and Disney Plus buy up the big ones, buy up stuff and then
Mm-hmm.
increase price on people. And it's basically gonna be like we're paying cable again for these
Yep.
streamers. I think that like we already see live sports going that way with Amazon
Yep.
and with Hulu.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're going to
YouTube
continue to
TV.
see that and you're
Mm-hmm.
going to end up I'm paying $20 a month on Netflix now because of how many devices I have it on. I want the ultra HD and all that
Yeah.
stuff.
4K.
But
Mm-hmm.
but I wouldn't be surprised if they try to move that price up again or Disney Plus's price up again because they have to start to be profitable. I'm super nervous about the MCU because the way that Bob Iger talks and all their properties they're trying to do in terms of their TV shows, some of that stuff might be getting cut. It might be on the
Mm-hmm.
chopping block. So I think that you're right. The content's probably going to have to decrease because they're spending too much money, but there's going to be a consolidation and increase in prices. I don't know how the market is going to react to that. Are people going to be like, okay, I need to have all these streaming services so I can see all my shows, or because there's just so much content. When I was growing up, I couldn't read both Marvel and DC. I didn't have anything against DC or even some of the smaller companies. I had just a few dollars to my name, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I read Marvel, you know, and
Yeah.
so
Yeah. Pick one.
that's what it was. And I feel like that's going to be the case with some of these shooters. People are like, okay, I just got to pick one, and that's what I'm rolling with, and that's it. So that goes to me against A.O. Scott's point of view in terms of streamers crowding out the market. I think it's going to end up, there's like a bubble that's going to burst there. And we're going to see
Mm-hmm.
either Paramounts and stuff like that just stop streaming altogether and go back to doing more traditional type of methods to get their content out there. Or they're going to start selling the rights to their stuff. And you'll see like these mergers of streaming services will be, the Hulu package will have, like you see this sometimes now with, I'm trying to think, Paramount's actually like that where you have like MTV and all that other stuff under it. Or am I thinking about
Mm-hmm.
HBO that has all those different types of properties under it? I think that you're going to just see more of that.
Yeah, Amazon has a lot of that under there too. But I absolutely see this happening for sure. I definitely see the bubble bursting that you're talking about. People are going to have to choose one. And I think maybe that's Netflix's play. Maybe Netflix people will feel that it's so much of a must-have that you can let all the other streamers go and just keep Netflix. I can definitely see a world where people have two streaming services. It would be Netflix and Disney Plus,
Mm-hmm.
and everything else will have to, like you said, consolidate. I don't see HBO budging at all either. Actually, I think there's another streamer that isn't going anywhere. But like you said, Paramounts, I can see the Hulu's merging into something else, even though, like you said, you can get other packages on Hulu and Amazon at
Mm-hmm.
that. I can definitely see them having to then license their content to other streaming services because I I just know how much everything is beginning to cost. How much inflation is going down. It's not just streaming services, right? It's food. Eggs are $10. You know what I'm saying? Like it's just a lot going on, and so I even myself, I pay for way too many streaming services for sure. But it's because, like I said, I know I have to keep up on certain things. I'm even starting to think, man, I might have to give up on Stars, might have to give up on Paramount, might have to give up on Showtime, I might have to give
Criterion,
up on
all of them.
Criterion Channel, Shutter.
And
Even I love
those are
Shutter.
cheap.
No, they're cheap, and it's starting to feel like they're less necessary because something else is becoming more necessary, I think, in that way. So yeah, it's a very interesting dilemma. I think I don't know how it's going to go down, but I do have a feeling people are about to start jumping ship on some of these streaming services.
Yeah. My final thoughts. A.O. Scott, he will be missed. We are losing a pretty important voice that was challenging. I would say probably about 30% of his stuff I agree with, 70% I didn't. So I guess
Hmm.
we didn't really align on a lot of stuff. But that's the point. You're supposed to have conversations about this stuff and be
Yeah.
able to say, I like this for these reasons, and you like these for these reasons, and kind of meet in the middle. There's very few movies that are just completely loved by everyone, right?
Yeah,
Even
sure.
even if you go to your AFI 100, and somebody's going to have a problem with every single one of those films. So I think that I
Hmm.
really want him to hopefully find peace with it, but also he's a little bit off base with some of the things that he's feeling, and when people get jaded, that's just what happens. I think that film is in a very interesting place in terms of its growth of opportunities and growth of new voices. But I also understand that with new technologies and just new preferences for the average moviegoers, studios, movie theaters, everyone has to get more creative in how to get these films watched, these pieces of art in front of folks.
Hmm.
How about you?
I think there are some things about that A.L. Scott was saying that I can see how the landscape has changed. I think over the years of how fandoms have become more of a thing. I will absolutely agree with that. Me and Jordan actually just talked about the TV show Swarm on
Mm-hmm.
our podcast, where we do talk about stan culture and things like that, and how sometimes how malicious I think stan culture can be. And I will say there is some of that in the fandom of superhero films. Absolutely, I'm not saying it doesn't exist at all. It definitely does in some form or fashion, but I don't think he was painting the complete picture when it came to blaming fandom and the rise of superhero films in cinema for the reasons, one of the reasons in which he's stepping down, I think, or changing his jobs from being a film critic. I think there's more to it than what he was saying, and I think that I think just because the ways to ingest films are different, I don't think he should shy away from that. In fact, I think he should embrace it, because just like you said, A.L. Scott was challenging. There's a lot of things, like you said, that I've read of A.L. Scott. So I was like, I don't know about this. I don't know if I agree
Mm-hmm.
with your take on these movies in particular. I think you're a little wild here, but the fact that there was somebody at least challenging those ideas, to me, is a healthy thing. Film isn't meant, it's an art form, right? Like you said, there's nothing that is completely beloved by everybody. No artwork or film is completely loved by any and everybody. And I love and welcome that. I think that conversation to be had across all mediums. It's part of what makes this fun. I think. Oh, you don't like this movie? Why don't you like it? I love it, and I love it for these
Mm-hmm.
reasons. But I'm very curious of why you don't like it. Let's have a conversation about that, and something else can bloom from that. That's the magic. One of the magics of cinema, right? Is can be those discrepancies and those disagreements. So I think, like you said, hopefully it's a hiatus, because he was a big voice. He was somebody that I could be like, I'm sure A.L. Scott doesn't agree with me. Let me go see what he said. I definitely a lot of times did that. Like, oh, let's see what he said about the film. But I think as the landscape of film is changing, I think we should also change with it and also help shape it, right? As people who are narrating, I think, the change, right? As critics, film critics, whatever you want to call us, just fans first and foremost. As it's changing, I think more people in our space, like us, should also help. I think shift the narrative into something new, and even put pressure on the ways in which people ingest these things and the way people think about the way film is made. So yeah, those are my final thoughts.
Thank you, Desmond. You reminded me of something. I feel bad that his last or his penultimate movie was 65, which was not good whatsoever. So that's a
Ooh,
terrible movie to go
bad
out on
bad movie to go out
criticism on.
on.
I think that because he said he was watching, well, if you listen to the podcast, he said he was watching that one, and then he had no one that night, and that was it. I think his last movie was actually Scream 6, if I remember how screeners went here in Kansas
Mm.
City. But I also know he's not a really big fan of horror. So he may not just have had a good day coming out of film criticism, but neither here nor there. Do what you do, man. Desmond, where can we find you?
Any and everywhere. We got Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Two Black Nerds. At Two Black Nerds. That's the number two Black Nerds. Also, twoblacknerds.com/podcast is all of our links to every podcast outlet you can think of. And also just twoblacknerds.com, no slash or anything, for where our merchandise resides, man. That's where you can find us.
Get some merch, follow them. I'm telling you, it's one of my favorite follows out there. And hopefully you're going to see Desmond. Maybe you'll see Jordan on the channel eventually. I want to speak for him
Yeah.
on a live like that. But hopefully we all three of us can do something again here in the near future. Thank you so much, Desmond. Peace, bro.
Thank you so much, man, for having me on here.